Well, thank you very much indeed, Pete, Spiros, and also Fred, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to hear me this evening. It may well have struck you as rather appropriate that a Greek foundation and an institute named after the son of Greek immigrants should support a lecture on the subject of fiscal crisis. This was by no means foreseen when I was invited to give this lecture many months ago. And you may also be struck by the somewhat Hellenic quality of my first slide. Like so many once intelligent people, I too am a slave to PowerPoint, but I hope you'll see quite why I'm using this technology as the evening progresses. That image of a Greek or possibly Roman column comes from one of the great cycle of paintings that hangs in the New York Historical Society by the Hudson School American artist Thomas Cole. This extraordinary sequence of paintings, which you all should go and take a look at, inspired me to write an essay in a recent edition of Foreign Affairs on the way in which empires rise and fall. The way the artist depicts it is the way most of you, I suspect, think about it. It's a story of birth, of rise, of zenith, of decline, and of fall. It's a cyclical story, a gradual story. The life cycle of empire is something that we all, I think, carry around, embedded in our consciousness. And we assume that empires follow roughly this trajectory. And after the zenith, there comes a gradual decline and fall. That, after all, is the title of the greatest work of history ever written, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which incidentally covers more than 1,000 years. If empires decline that gradually, then I suppose we, relatively near to the zenith of the American empire, can feel relaxed. But the theme of my talk this evening, and indeed of that essay in Foreign Affairs, is that very little in the realm of financial history, and particularly the realm of fiscal history, is gradual or cyclical. On the contrary, what I want to emphasize this evening is the non-linearity of fiscal history, the suddenness with which things can go wrong in the realm of public finance, and from there to the realm of geopolitics. I'm going to begin with a little contemporary stuff, if I can find the keyboard. We're living through, as I'm sure I hardly need to point out, a debt explosion in the developed world. This first slide shows the net public debt of major advanced economies from the 1990s projected forward to 2014 by the International Monetary Fund. And you can see the explosive increase, for example, in Japan's net public debt to above 130% of gross domestic product, overtaking Italy, a remarkable feat for students of public finance. Notice also the great upsurge in the net public debt of nearly all the other major developed economies towards the 80% threshold, with further, as we'll see, to go. Canada alone seems to have avoided this extraordinary debt explosion. This kind of fiscal crisis, this great rise in the ratio between debt and gross domestic product, can periodically spook governments into drastic emergency action. This slide shows what happened in the European bond market in the last few weeks and months. And what it shows is the explosion of the borrowing costs of the Greek government from being, in November of last year, only perhaps 100 basis points higher than the borrowing costs of other European countries notably the core European economy, Germany's. The Greek yield on the long-term government bond exploded to close to 20% at its peak, as investors in Europe and around the world suddenly woke up to the fact that Greece was on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. I've been arguing for some time, and I noticed that the New York Times recently, indeed yesterday, took up this argument, that the experience of Greece is not peculiar to that country, but is in fact a warning to many other countries in the Western world of what can happen if you pursue an unsustainable fiscal course. It's just that Greece is the first of the borrowers to get caught out by market sentiment, in the same way that Bear Stearns was the first of the investment banks to get caught out by market sentiment in the financial crisis that began in the summer of 2007. The story of the age of leverage, as I've called it elsewhere, continues. What began in the household sector, spread to the banking sector, has reached the sovereigns, has reached the public sector. And all of us, not only Greeks, but all of us in the Western world, with a few notable exceptions like the Canadians, now have to grapple with extraordinary challenges to avoid Greek tragedies in our own economies. Well, as Peterson pointed out, I'm an historian incidentally with no ambitions to replicate the unique career of Henry Kissinger. My sole ambition is to write a book that accurately chronicles that extraordinary story. As an historian, I'm struck by the fact that crises of the sort that we've witnessed in the last weeks and months in Europe are nothing new. In fact, they're as old as the bond market, and the bond market's quite old. As I tried to show in The Ascent of Money, there's been a bond market since 12th century Venice. It was the Italians, rather than the Greeks, who invented the idea that it might be best to finance government undertakings of an extraordinary nature, like wars, by borrowing from citizens rather than by taxing them. So bonds began to trade in northern Italy in the medieval period, and part of the story of The Ascent of Money is the spread of this form of finance throughout the Western world and finally throughout the world as a whole. What this picture tells you is the story of the great crisis between the middle of the 18th century and 1815, which occurred when Britain and France fought for global supremacy. From the 7 Years' War, through the American War of Independence, through the Revolutionary Wars in Europe, to the Napoleonic Wars, the great conflict between the French and the British was a fiscal as much as it was a naval or military conflict. And this was a conflict that the British emphatically won. What the chart shows you is in the green line the yield on British consols, that's to say the interest paid to investors on British government debt. The console was the treasury of its day, a long-term, in fact notionally perpetual bond that had been issued by the British since the mid-18th century. And as you can see, even at its very height, at the time when things were going worst in the 1790s in the war with France, yields on consols barely rose above 6%. Compare that with the French cost of borrowing. First in the blue line, the 5% Royal Rente, and then, or rather, the Emprunt d'Octobre, that was one of the loans issued by the French royal government before the revolution, and then the 5% Rente that was issued in the late revolutionary, early Napoleonic period. The French Revolution caused a complete breakdown of French public finance, but French public finance had been in trouble really throughout the 18th century. And one good explanation that historians have come up with for the French Revolution is precisely this. At root, the revolution was a fiscal crisis. It was the fiscal crisis of the Ancien Régime that required the French monarch to summon the Estates General, and that, of course, began the revolution. But the revolution precipitated an even more severe deterioration in French public finance, a complete collapse of the currency, a new currency, the assignat, and an explosion, as you can see, of the borrowing costs of the French state. In fact, that red line were one to represent it accurately, goes far off the chart. In the pre-Napoleonic period, French borrowing costs were stratospherically high because of the hyperinflation that had occurred. If you calculate a spread by subtracting British yields from French yields, you can see just how significant the British advantage was. 700 basis points in the period after the victory in the 7 Years' War, a spread that was dramatically compressed by Britain's failure to control its American colonies, but which then blew out again as revolution spread across the Atlantic from the United States to France. Ladies and gentlemen, the work that I've done over many years, going back to the history I wrote of the Rothschild Bank, and it's always good to get a message from Henry Kissinger in mid-lecture, but perhaps you could tell Henry I'll call him back. The work I've done since my history of the Rothschild family has explored the way this kind of pattern of fiscal divergence has repeated itself throughout the period from the late 18th century to the present. I'm just going to show you a few slides that illustrate the way financial history can illuminate the mainstream history that most of us are familiar with. This slide takes the story of the international bond market from 1870 through to the mid-1890s. And in this case, as in the case of the next two charts, I'm just calculating the spreads between other governments' borrowing costs and British government borrowing costs, expressed in terms of basis points, that's to say, fractions of a percent. What's really interesting here is that if you go back to the 1870s, there's a familiar sight, because up there, with a 5,000 basis point spread over consols, is indeed Greece. And the Greek crisis is a really fascinating one, because it illustrates a point that I'm going to revert to later. The credibility of a government as a borrower is bound up with a number of things. But one of them is the stability of its domestic politics, because, of course, without domestic political stability, it's very hard to raise taxation, and therefore it's very hard to pay the interest on your debt. Greece was going through a profound constitutional crisis in the 1870s that wasn't really resolved until the end of that decade. And that, I think, was something that investors were acutely conscious of. Mexico, too, stands out as one of the bad boys of that era, as, interestingly, does Uruguay and Turkey. In each case, crises of either war or internal politics, and sometimes both, drove investors to sell bonds and therefore to drive up the yields on the bonds. In the period from 1895 to 1919, there was a pattern of convergence, which in many ways should be familiar to us today, because we saw a very similar pattern of bond market convergence from 2000 to 2007. This was an extraordinary period in which, in highly liquid financial markets, the spreads on emerging market bonds came down to just 20, 30, up to 100 basis points over US Treasuries or German bunds. Much the same happened in what's been called the first age of globalization, from the mid-1890s to 1914. Governments like, say, that of Egypt became dramatically more creditworthy, not least because, in Egypt's case, it came under direct British rule. But with the outbreak of the First World War, the pattern of convergence broke down. Exploding deficits to pay for the war and surging public debts caused an increase in risk in the eyes of investors. And by the end of the war, the risk was really explosive in some of the marginal countries, and of course, in the losers of the war. In the period after the end of World War I, there was some convergence in the illusory tranquility or prosperity of the 1920s, but some countries, even before the Great Depression, had spiraled out of fiscal control. Once again, the standout country in this chart is Mexico. If time permitted, I could tell you a story about each of these jagged lines. I have to admit that they bring out the nerd in me, because in some ways, what these lines tell you is the way in which financial markets voted on the credibility of a government's fiscal policy. And what's most striking is the way in which, very suddenly, confidence could be lost in a country. The interesting thing to notice is that advanced economies are not exempt from the kind of crisis that we traditionally have associated with Latin America or Central and Eastern Europe. It's not just South American economies that get into real difficulty, nor was it just Middle Eastern and East European economies. In a wonderful book, my colleague Ken Rogoff has co-authored with Carmen Reinhardt, which I heartily recommend to you, This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, they show just how many countries, including countries we think of as quite developed, have experienced episodes of default or rescheduling, which is just a fancy word for default. This chart simply ranks them, and it's not too surprising to find Honduras, Ecuador, Greece, Nicaragua, Mexico and Peru, not forgetting Russia, right up at the top of the chart, with really huge numbers of years in those countries' history since 1800 being characterized by default or debt rescheduling. But if you carry on down the list, you encounter some more surprising names. There's Spain, for example, Austria, and gosh, just below Turkey, you'll find Germany. The Germans, who like to strike attitudes of great fiscal rectitude, and they've been striking a lot of those just lately, strike them partly because of the harsh memory of 2 massive fiscal disasters in their history, one caused by the First World War and the other caused by the Second World War. Catastrophes that were accompanied by full-scale default on public debt and hyperinflation. This table illustrates that, yes, it happens to the best of us. Even the United Kingdom deserves a place in the roll of dishonor, because as I pointed out to Ken Rogoff, he'd overlooked it. The United Kingdom defaulted on part of its external debt, its debt to the United States after World War II, and that debt was not fully paid off until the chancellorship of Gordon Brown. Let's come up to the present and look ahead to the future and reflect a little bit on the crisis that we find ourselves in at the moment. As I've tried to imply, this is a pretty familiar story. Countries get into positions of excessive indebtedness, the markets overnight lose faith in the credibility of fiscal policy, and the rest you know. Looking here at a recent paper from the Bank for International Settlements, it's impossible not to be struck by the extreme instability of public finance in these countries, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain, known rather rudely in my view as the pigs in some quarters. Now, what's striking about the Bank for International Settlements projections is that they show current policies leading to debt explosions of mind-blowing proportions in each of these countries over the next 30 years. The baseline scenario, the red dotted line, just assumes that no policy change happens. If that's the case, then by 2040, the Portuguese debt-GDP ratio is about 275%, the Irish is 300%, the Greeks win the race on 400%, and Spain comes in on 300%. Notice, though, that even if these countries make significant fiscal reforms, including attacking the problem of aging populations and welfare budgets, none of them comes back down below 100%. Even in the rosiest blue line scenario, they all end up with debt GDP ratios above 100%. And a reminder for those of you who haven't picked it up, Ken Rogoff made the point in a paper back in January that 90% is really the threshold, after which public debt tends to be associated with problems of low growth or high inflation, usually both. Well, we can sit, whether it's in Washington or in London, and make mock of the pigs and the Greek tragedy that's unfolded, but if we do that, then we do so at our peril. Because the Bank for International Settlements also produces projections for these English-speaking countries, and they don't make pretty sights. In the case of the United Kingdom, if there isn't a radical change in fiscal policy, and I'm happy to say one is just beginning, the debt GDP ratio explodes to 500%, in fact slightly more, and for the United States the equivalent figure is 450%. You don't need to have a PhD in economics to see that that's actually worse than all of the pigs. And that insight, which hit me forcibly a few months ago, gave rise to my favorite headline of the last few months, a headline which I wasn't allowed to publish, by Lionel Barber, the editor of the Financial Times, who I think was a real killjoy. And it's this headline which I'd like to share with you this evening. Pigs are us, ladies and gentlemen. And it really is no consolation to say, but at least we're not in a monetary union with the Germans, and we can therefore print our way out of this. I don't find it very reassuring to imagine us printing our way out of a crisis of public debt, because we've done that sort of thing in the past, and unless you've got a very short memory, you'll remember where it got us. Let's look a little bit more closely at what I'm going to call the metrics of doom. The metrics of doom are really ways in which we can compute fiscal sustainability, and I'm going to share two with you. One is the Bank for International Settlements cyclically adjusted primary balance, which is a terrible mouthful. Really, the primary balance is just the deficit, or of course possibly surplus, excluding interest payments on past debt. And it's usually seen by economists as a really pretty critical measure, because if you're in a debt crisis, that needs to be positive. If it's not, then you're heading towards a kind of Ponzi scheme, where increasingly you're borrowing money in order simply to pay the interest on the money you already borrowed. This is Madoff finance. If you look at the cyclically adjusted primary balances in the right-hand column, you'll see that Greece has a painful minus 6% of GDP. And that's what all the fuss has been about. But guess what? The equivalent figure for the United Kingdom is 6.8%, and the figure for the United States is 7.3%. So we are, in a sense, outpigging the pigs. Even more strikingly, if you look at the IMF's recent projections of what countries need to do in the way of fiscal adjustment in order to stabilize their debt-GDP ratios at, the IMF suggests, 60% of GDP by 2030, the adjustments are really very remarkable indeed. Just to be clear, by fiscal adjustment, what I mean here is the percentage of GDP by which fiscal policy has to contract, either through tax increases or through spending cuts, probably through some combination of the two, to prevent a public debt explosion. I've ranked the problem so that you can see who's worst off. Japan is worst off. It would have to achieve a fiscal tightening of 13.4% of GDP to stabilize its debt-GDP ratio, even at 80%. Then I'm afraid, and I say I'm afraid for the sake of David Cameron and George Osborne, because it's their harsh task to clear up this mess, then comes the United Kingdom. And, of course, it's not surprising to see the usual suspects lined up behind them: Ireland, Spain, Greece, Portugal. But, before we get to Portugal, there's the United States. The fiscal adjustment the US would have to make in order to stabilize its debt-GDP ratio is, in fact, 0.2% of GDP less than that which Greece has to make. So there is really no significant fiscal difference, though there is a difference in monetary regime, between Greece and the United States. Many people find this hard to believe. In fact, it causes all kinds of disquiet when I make this point to audiences. But I didn't make these numbers up. They're numbers, as I've said, from the International Monetary Fund. And here's perhaps the most striking chart I can show you about our present and future predicament. The BIS has calculated projected interest payments in relation to GDP for all the major developed countries. And yeah, the picture is certainly pretty bleak for Greece, which on its present course would end up spending more than 20% of GDP on interest by 2040. But look at the right-hand chart, and you'll see that powering ahead in the interest payment stakes are, once again, the United Kingdom and the United States. This projection suggests that by 2040, unless there's a radical change of course, the United States will be spending over 20% of GDP on interest payments on the federal debt. Guess what? That's exactly the percentage of GDP that the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimates will be raised as tax revenue by the federal government. Once again, you don't need a PhD in economics to do this math. That implies that by 2040, unless we radically change course, all federal tax revenues will be consumed by debt service. Ladies and gentlemen, during the financial crisis, many economists picked up their dusty copies of John Maynard Keynes's general theory and pronounced that deficits would save us. And this argument was made not only by Paul Krugman in the New York Times, but also by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times. It seems to me that these commentators confused flows and stocks. By looking only at flows, they made a perfectly legitimate argument that an upsurge in private sector saving needed to be compensated for by an upsurge in public sector borrowing to avoid a collapse in demand and a depression. Fair enough, at least over a short period of crisis. But one has to also take account of the existing stock of debt, because Keynesian policies in many Western countries came on top of long-lasting structural crises of public finance, which had driven debt-GDP ratios up already to dangerous heights. Ignore those past debts, think only in terms of the flows and not the stocks, and you completely fail to foresee the unintended consequences of hyper-Keynesian policy. I believe we're witnessing these consequences today, and Greece was the first to blow out. Let's reflect, ladies and gentlemen, historically, about what causes these crises. Well, in one way, it's really obvious. It's excessive debt, however you measure it. And you can measure it in better ways than debt to GDP. You can measure it by comparing debt to revenue or debt to exports, if a large part of the debt is held by foreigners, which incidentally it is in the case of the United States, as well as in the case of Greece. I think a better metric, though, is to look at excessive interest payments. In my historical view, it's when a government is spending a rising share of tax revenues on interest payments that it starts to get into trouble. And this is a really important point that I want to emphasize, no matter how sleepy you may be feeling, having listened to my monotonous voice now for really quite some time. You can relate debt service payments to GDP, but I think it's more important to look at tax revenue, because when the nasty fiscal arithmetic really kicks in, it kicks in there. Only a few years ago, the United States was spending less than 7% of federal revenues on interest payments in the federal debt. The debt wasn't that huge and interest rates were very low. But on present trajectories, we will quite quickly get to the point when a fifth of federal revenues are going on interest payments. And, as I've said, if the BIS is right, within 3 decades, it will be 100%. Of course, it never will get there, because that's just impossible. What a crisis like this does is to force impossibly difficult political decisions about what is going to be sacrificed in order to pay the debt, or which debtors are going to be sacrificed to maintain other payments. Another cause of crisis is, of course, an excessive reliance on foreign capital. Many of the great debt crises of the 19th and 20th century were crises caused when foreign investors took fright at unsustainable policies. And that's been a really important part of the story in Europe. Italy is much less vulnerable than Greece in this respect, because most Italian debt, like most Japanese debt, is held by natives. It's not actually held by foreigners. But the Greek position was really quite extreme, where a huge proportion of Greek debt was held overseas. And in the United States, the situation at the moment is about half the federal debt is in foreign hands, including, of course, a very substantial chunk in the hands of the People's Republic of China. Let's dig a bit deeper. What really causes these crises? Well, part of the cause is economic weakness. When your economy grows slowly, or when the returns on private sector investment are low, then you're much more likely to get into the debt trap. Low growth can breed large deficits because tax revenues disappoint. And of course, if the GDP doesn't grow fast and the debt does, then very quickly you find yourself in trouble. Milton Friedman famously said, and we have at least one of his pupils in the room, that inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I want to suggest to you that public debt crises are always and everywhere a political phenomenon. They are consequences of political weakness. Excessive expenditure and insufficient taxation, failures to make decisions about unsustainable fiscal policies are political. They are not the results of profound economic processes. Finally, we need to remember, to invoke a previous lecturer in this series, irrational exuberance. Investors keep forgetting to learn from history, no matter how hard I try to teach it. Some people, as is illustrated by the history of Argentina's yield spread, and this is the spread over British government debt, 1870 to 1914, two great defaults in this period, one very famous in 1890, which blew up Barings Bank. Some people just never learn, because Argentina just keeps doing this, and it will just keep doing this until there's some profound change in Argentina's political economy. And this is true no matter how often. Here's the Turkish story. Turkey, and here I'll say something that the Greeks in the audience will enjoy. Turkey's really had a pretty disastrous fiscal history. One of the most spectacular defaults of the entire 19th century came in the mid-1870s, when the Ottoman Empire defaulted on its external debt. And that caused a huge blowout of the spreads, 8,000 basis points. Wow, you really didn't want to be on the wrong end of that trade back in the 1870s. And it just does keep on happening. Here's the history of Turkish spreads over US Treasuries from 1999 to 2008. So part of the problem is that we seem incapable of learning from the history of the bond market. And that itself is a very puzzling phenomenon. Peter Lindert did a study quite a few years ago now, which illustrates the extraordinary way in which investors just refuse to learn. What he and his co-author did was to compare the ex-ante returns that investors expected when they bought foreign bonds with the ex-post returns that they actually got on a sample of countries. And here they are, including some emerging markets and some not-so-emerging markets, some established markets like Canada. What's amazing is that if you compare the ex-ante and the ex-post numbers, only in the case of Canada, and only in 2 out of 3 sub-periods, did investments in sovereign bonds actually surprise on the upside. In all other cases, the ex-post returns on foreign sovereign debt were less than the expected returns. That seems to me to be a pattern. And it also seems to me to be quite a strong recommendation to invest in Canadian debt. What are the ways out of a debt crisis? That surely should be the burning question in the Western world today, on both sides of the Atlantic. What do we do now that we are in this situation? Well, ladies and gentlemen, in theory, there are 6 ways out, which I will share with you now. One is to raise the growth rate of your economy. The second is to lower the interest rate on your borrowing. The third is to get bailed out by somebody. That's the route that at the very last minute the Greeks were able to go down. The fourth, of course, is fiscal pain. You increase taxes or you cut public spending and you try to run a primary budget surplus. You start, if you possibly can, to pay off the debt. The fifth is that you print money. That fancy term seigniorage is just a fancy term for printing money in order to inflate the debt away. And the sixth option is to default. There are all kinds of wonderful words for default that you need to know because they'll be appearing in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times quite frequently in the months ahead. You can have repudiation, standstill, a moratorium, restructuring, rescheduling, and so on. But it all boils down to changing the terms of the original loan, default. Unfortunately, I have to strike out 3 of these 6 options right away. Because certainly from the vantage point of the United States, they're very unlikely to materialize. It's very hard for me to believe, given our present predicament, that we're going to see a sudden upsurge in economic growth in the United States. I think one consequence of the financial crisis has been to lower the growth path of the United States. At this point, we've seen some slight recovery in the US 10-year yield, but that, of course, reflects a flight to safety as investors have exited Europe. At the moment, the view persists that US Treasuries are a safe haven, the safe haven for investors. But as I pointed out in the Financial Times some months ago, US Treasuries are a safe haven the way Pearl Harbor was a safe haven in 1941. Safe, but not for much longer. The nasty fiscal arithmetic sooner or later catches up with all sovereign borrowers, no matter how strong they feel themselves to be, which just leaves fiscal pain, inflation, or default. Cut, print, or default. Ladies and gentlemen, history affords only one example of a country that managed to get itself out from an excessive debt to GDP burden without either inflating or defaulting. The only case that I can find is Britain after 1815. For a long century, Britain paid down its debt through growth and through running primary budget surpluses. There was no default, there was no inflation. But this, unfortunately, is the only case that history offers us. And remember, Britain did have some unusual advantages at that time. It was, of course, the first country to enjoy an industrial revolution. It also had the world's biggest empire to draw on. And it had a non-democratic franchise throughout the period, which meant that property was represented and the propertyless essentially were not. That makes it much easier to take tough fiscal decisions, believe me. So that just leaves us with two options. Printing, and that's much easier for a country with monetary sovereignty like the United States or the United Kingdom. It's impossible for Greece unless Monsieur Trichet agrees to print for them. Or alternatively, default, which I believe not only Greece but other Eurozone economies will ultimately do. Because no bailout can essentially achieve the drastic contraction in fiscal policy that the Greeks have committed themselves to undertake. And I don't believe that that contraction is politically viable. Let me illustrate, as I draw to a welcome conclusion, two great Anglosphere debt reduction stories. Let's go back to the end of World War II, which was the last time that Britain and the United States had really huge debt to GDP ratios. The United States was well up above 120%. The United Kingdom at the end of World War II had gone above 250% of GDP. And as you can see in this chart, by the 1970s, these burdens had been drastically reduced, well below 100%. In the case of the United States, in the 1970s, when Pete Peterson was in government, this simply wasn't an issue at all because the debt was down towards 30% of GDP. There were other issues at stake, but certainly that was not one of them. Let's now look at how the debt was reduced. What this calculation does, and I owe it to Willem Buiter, is to decompose the reduction in debt into growth, inflation, and budget surpluses. And what you can see there is that in the case of the United States, the debt reduction was achieved by a combination of growth and inflation, certainly not by budget surpluses, which actually were so few and far between that current fiscal policy added to the debt. For the UK, it's almost all a story of inflation. Although 98 percentage points of the reduction can be attributed to growth, 124% was subtracted from that achievement by budget deficits, leaving nearly all the reduction to be achieved through inflation. My poor grandmother was one of many people who invested their savings in war bonds during World War II. War bonds were among the worst investments of the 20th century. And it was just unfortunate that nobody had explained to my grandmother what a real interest rate was. If they had, she might have realized that she was earning negative real returns on her patriotic investment. So one lesson of history is bondholders beware. If you look at the real annual returns on British and American bonds in the 20th century, the period after World War II was characterized by 4 decades of negative returns. These are the annual returns on both British and American government bonds adjusted for inflation. It wasn't until the 1980s that bond investors got anything like positive returns. What are the implications? Not only the economic implications, but the geopolitical implications. This was my favorite cartoon of last year, and I want to share it with you. Chinese sub threatens the US Navy. The Chinese submarine captain is saying, "Turn around or we sell all our T-bills." I thought this was mildly funny when I saw it last year. When the United States announced arms exports to Taiwan the other day, it turned out to be a policy option that some Chinese military officers were willing to discuss in public. So, not so funny. What, I repeat, are the geopolitical implications? President Obama has made something of a custom of bowing to Asian leaders. This is another cartoon I rather liked. Good grief, now he's curtsying. There's a big question, really, which is the question that Larry Summers asked and Pete Peterson posed just before I began speaking. How long can the world's biggest debtor go on being the world's strongest power? When roughly half the federal debt is in foreign hands, and a chunk of that is in the hands of the obvious strategic rival in the century ahead, that's a pretty good question to ask. Well, let me offer three lessons of history that I think directly relate to the predicament of the United States today. I'm going to begin by telling you what governments don't do with World War-sized debt burdens. And let me reiterate, the debt burdens that we currently face in the Western world are those we have previously only seen in times of world war. It's like we had the financial consequences of a world war without the world war. What governments don't do is slash expenditure entitlements, reduce marginal tax rates on income and corporate profits to stimulate growth, raise taxes and consumption to try and balance the budget and encourage saving, and grow their way out of the problem without defaulting or depreciating their currencies. As I've said, there's only one exception to this rule, and that was Imperial Britain after 1815. Let's look at what governments usually do with World War-sized debt burdens. One, they tend to oblige, subtly or not so subtly, central banks and commercial banks to hold government debt. That, of course, is already happening on both sides of the Atlantic. Two, they sometimes restrict alternative investment opportunities for citizens and firms. Capital controls were a feature, of course, of the post-World War II era. Three, they tend to default on their commitments to politically weak groups at home and foreign creditors. And three, ultimately, if they can, they condemn bond investors to negative real interest rates. But I just want to make a point that's very important here. There are fewer naive investors in government bonds today than there were in 1945. And the term structure of government debt today is much shorter than it was in 1945. Many people assume we will inflate the debt away like we did after 45. I want to suggest to you, and it's the most important point, that it may be harder to do that than we think. That in fact, as the Greeks discovered, when the markets wake up to a risk of inflation or default, they drive up the borrowing costs far ahead of any rise in the inflation rate. And a country finds itself being crushed by rising real rates. That's a much more plausible scenario for me than a magic inflation that comes along and catches the investors out. It's no longer people like my granny who sit on piles of US treasuries and UK gilts. It's institutional investors managed by very smart people, not to mention our old friends, the bond vigilantes. Lesson number 3. What are the geopolitical consequences of crises of public finance? Well, first, in fiscal stabilizations, discretionary military expenditure is always the first casualty. Secondly, in cases of default on external debt, there can be conflicts with the creditors who get, to put it impolitely, screwed. Thirdly, in cases of radical currency depreciation, your reserve currency status can be lost. Just look at what happened to the British pound in the post-45 period. This chart, and it's one of the last ones I'll force you to look at, looks at defense expenditure and debt service, defense is red, debt service is blue, as percentages of federal revenues since the 1960s. Those lines are going to cross soon. Within, I would say, the next 6 years, interest payments on the federal debt will exceed the defense budget. I think one of the clear lessons of history is that that is a major turning point for any power, from Spain in the 17th century, the Netherlands in the 18th century, through the Turks in the 19th century, and the British in the 20th century. When you're spending more on your debt than on your army or navy, it's all over as a great power. It's no longer entirely possible to use the words Goldman Sachs without arousing a wry smile in an audience, but these figures, I think, are kosher. Jim O'Neill, as the chief economist, has been projecting gross domestic product forward for the major economies of the world, and for some years now he's been arguing that by 2027 the gross domestic product of China will equal that of the United States, and by 2050 India will have caught up. Now, history is not like this. The lines are never smooth. But I think the long-term trajectory is plausible, and this really seems to me to be the most profound implication of the story that I'm telling. Ladies and gentlemen, let me revert to Thomas Cole's great life cycle of empire. The point that I'm trying to make is very simple. It's not 1,000 years that separates imperial zenith from imperial oblivion. It's really a very, very short ride from the top to the bottom. Thank you very much indeed.